Okay, in today's episode, guys, we're going to be talking about power training for hockey players. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at a problem here, which is how to develop it and not just express it as a hockey player. And it's a common thing I see. So I'm going to giving you a couple of insights really into how we can avoid the common issue we see, which is only expressing what we've got and not developing the qualities that actually make you more powerful as an athlete. So the problem fundamentally is that hockey players frequently express power in training but aren't developing it. So, for example, I just pulled up a video of me here doing a broad jump. This is an example of what people might define as a power exercise. But what I'm going to look at is the fact that, yes, we are expressing power through this movement. We aren't necessarily developing the qualities that increase our power. And there are some fundamental reasons for this, which I'll dive into. But one of those things is the fact that for our bodies to adapt, we have to give it more than it has experienced before. But when we express power in a movement like this, we're not asking it to do anything more than it can currently do because it can only do what it can do. We have to develop the qualities that allow us to express greater levels of power, which we're going to be looking at in a second. So, first problem from what I can see is that a lot of times from clients who come to work with me, for example, they might have done programs before and they might have been doing exercises like this, which aren't a problem themselves. It's the thought process behind, if I do this, I'll become more powerful. It's not quite as straightforward as that. So just be mindful of the fact and ask yourself the question, am I increasing my power or am I just expressing the power that I already have? That's the first thing to kind of address. So the fundamental problem we're looking at is the kind of training principle 101, as I've called it here, which is that overload is required in order to increase our power for any physical quality. If you want to get faster, you want to get stronger, you want to increase muscle size, you want to increase our mobility, our bodies only adapt when they're given a stimulus that is above the level that we've experienced before. And that is the basic training principle of overload, which is true of all things. It's a principle that will never go away. It's existed for hundreds of years. It's just the way our bodies work. In order to adapt, we need to have a stimulus that is greater than we've experienced before. It'd be lovely if we didn't need to do that and we could just adapt, get stronger with very little effort. But in reality, we do need to really push ourselves in order to get that overload to actually occur. So, what is it? Well, in this kind of quick quote here from a classical book, Zatsiorsky and Kramer's Strength Training Manual. What they said was to bring about positive changes in an athlete's state, and exercise overload must be applied. So for a body's state to change, if we kind of go from from this point to this point in our strength, well, we empower, then we have to actually overload it and not just express what we currently have. Another example of not overloading the body would be if we wanted to, for example, increase our conditioning, increase our aerobic capacity, let's say, and we only went and did the same 5K loop once a week, every week for 10 weeks, our bodies won't adapt unless there's a new overload applied to it. Now, if we haven't run any 5Ks before, we haven't run that distance, that would be overload. But if we've always done it, it's not a new stimulus. We'd have to change something. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for interval training, for example, because you can easily apply huge overload and cause the body to adapt and actually get the changes that we want. Whereas if you're just doing and expressing the same thing over and over and over again, it's not actually progressing you forward. And this is why so many times I see people who I speak to who are like so frustrated because they're not getting results, even though they're working really hard, even though they followed a plan. The problem is the plan isn't creating any overload. It's not making you any better. So we've got to overload the body. That's the first and foremost concern here. So our bodies adapt if the magnitude, so the amount or the level, if you like, of training stress that we experience is above our habitual level. So, for example, I've just used this little graph here to illustrate this in a simple format. Session 1 and session 2, and using these arbitrary units here. Let's say they're kilos. In session 1, we're doing 100. In session 2, we're doing 120. So that could be that we're doing some heavy load strength training. We're doing a deadlift, for example. Session 1, we've applied 100 kilos to the body. So the training stress experience is at a certain level. And then in session 2, we're going to increase that by 20 kilos. Now, that would be quite a quick jump, but it's just to kind of highlight the example here of what you need to do in order to allow the body to actually experience the overload and adapt. Loads of ways we can apply overload. So just more broadly, we can increase the amount of time we work for. We can increase the training density. That's the amount of work we're doing in a set period of time. We can increase the intensity of the work. So if we're working at 80%, we can work at 85%. We can increase the load, like this example. And we can just increase general volume of work that we're doing more broadly. There's loads of ways we can apply overload. When it comes to power, there are some things we have to do in order to actually increase that power. So we're going to look at that in just a second. But at a basic level, we have to apply overload, and it has to be a level above what we're used to. If we just do always what we've always done, we'll always get what we always got. So power definition, without getting too much into the kind of physics and the kind of science side of this, what power is, it's force times displacement divided by time. So to make that really simple, force is mass times acceleration. So if we wanted to, for example, have a very clear example of force, a maximal deadlift would be a good example of that, because we're moving a very high mass multiplied by a high rate of acceleration, or the intent is to accelerate it as fast as possible. And so therefore we create a lot of force. That's why we, in order to increase our levels of force capability, we have to lift heavy loads, because we have to actually force the muscle to produce enough force to overcome that mass. Whereas if we're just trying to use really, really light weights, our muscles don't need to generate massive amounts of force to overcome that. So they're not going to adapt because no overload is applied. Okay, nice and simple. Displacement is essentially how far that force is being applied over, the range of which it's being produced over. So if we're producing large amounts of force over a small amount of area, it's unlikely that lots of power is being developed. And that's why something like a short range of motion exercise, let's say, a partial range bench press, for example, even if you're lifting a heavy weight, there's a small displacement there. So it's unlikely that lots of power is going to be generated in that exercise. Whereas if you're using something, and I'll come around to this, but something like an Olympic lift where you've got a large displacement being produced, then power is going to be expressed enormously there. And again, we'll dive into the subtleties of expressing versus developing some of these qualities. Time, very simply, then, is all of that in the shortest time possible. So just have the Olympics, the classical examples of power being expressed are things like a javelin, a high jump, a long jump, a triple jump, because there's a large amount of force over a big range in a short period of time. And that's a good example there of power being expressed. We know what power is when we see it often in sport, but sometimes trying to actually dive into what we really mean here is important. Sometimes this is listed as force times velocity, but that doesn't take into consideration this displacement component and fundamentally that needs to be in a short time frame. So in the simplest terms possible, power is our ability to produce lots of force over a large distance quickly in a short time frame. So that is fundamentally what it is. Now, in order to develop these things, there are some things we've got to do. So in this paper, Maffeletti and colleagues back in 2016 looked at rate of force development. So subtleties here around what we mean by rate of force development versus power, but the same principles can apply here. If you want to try and improve our rate of force development, then there's two primary things here. Firstly, max muscle strength, again, because we know that force times by displacement divided by time is key here. And the things that contribute to our ability to exert maximal muscle strength are muscle cross-sectional area, so the size of the muscle, and the muscle activation that we can experience. And there's different types of training will elicit different adaptations. So if we're going to try purely to increase cross-sectional area, then a more traditional hypertrophy style program would be best suited towards this, as well as nutrition intervention. Muscle activation generally comes through from heavy load strength training, and also learning the skill of the execution of the movement, because the more we do that, the better we'll get at eliciting high levels of muscle activation, recruiting large numbers of muscle fibers and motor units to produce that movement as well. So that kind of sits underneath maximal muscle strength. That's why if we want to increase this, that's why heavy load strength training is going to be so important to this, as opposed to just expressing what we already have. Time to reach the force, then that's that time component. There's two things really. There are other factors, but I've just kind of simplified this down as much as possible. Muscle tendon stiffness. So the stiffness of the tendon allows us to express large amounts of force in a short amount of time, because we can transfer energy through the tendon more effectively than if you've got, if you've got a really, really ineffective tendon. Let's say that if we haven't got the ability to transfer that energy quickly, then we're going to dissipate energy a bit more, and we're not going to get that transfer of energy quite as effectively. Fiber type, then again, we can you perform different types of training to change our fiber types from slow twitch to fast twitch, and from the type 2A, type 2X fiber conversions. So the type of training we do is going to have a big impact then on our ability to produce force in that short time frame. So the two key things here then are producing lots of force and producing it in a short time frame. There's two components we need to look at here. And again, this is why, going back to this idea of just doing exercises that express these things, it's not going to develop it. It's just expressing what we currently have. Whereas if we increase our maximum muscle strength through the variables and physiological qualities that sit underneath this, then we're more likely to be able to produce higher levels of power, because we're actually producing more force. And what matters initially is actually just being able to produce more force. It doesn't matter if you can produce a tiny amount of force really fast, but it doesn't have any impact on sports performance. It's far better to be able to generate large amounts of force to begin with, and then develop the ability to express that quickly and in a short time frame. And ideally, we do both things. But fundamentally, the thing that's going to make the biggest difference to our ability to express power early on is simply getting stronger. And that's why people sometimes get this wrong, because they look at things as, if I do the thing, that's going to make me better at it. Whereas actually, sometimes it's the opposite way around. We have to do the things that sit underneath it that contribute to it. And that is how we can develop it and not just express it. Second to this is something called the force velocity curve. Fundamentally, what the force velocity curve shows is that as velocity increases of a movement, the force produced will begin to decrease. So, for example, in the top here, we've got huge amounts of force being produced. We're not going to be able to produce that in a short time frame. When we look at a muscle fiber itself, what you tend to see is it's actually this is kind of extrapolated out from this, but from within a muscle fiber, if that muscle fiber needs to produce lots of force, it can't contract quickly. It's going to have to contract slowly, because that's going to allow, again, without getting too much into physiology, that's going to allow more force to be produced through increased number of cross bridges being formed within the fiber itself. So if you think about a really fast movement, it's unlikely you're going to produce large amounts of force. But if you're producing large amounts of force, it's unlikely the movement's going to be quick. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we're trying to do like a really, really heavy maximal deadlift, for example, at like 90 to 100% of 1RM, if you've ever done this before, obviously it's a massive amount of exertion in this movement. The movement itself is going to be slow. If, however, we're doing movements that are moving really, really fast, there's not going to be large amounts of force being produced. So this is this kind of dichotomy. We have to make sure that we're training both ends of it, because that will contribute to peak power expression in the middle. Whereas if we're only doing the movements that sit in this mid-range here and actually expressing power, we're neither developing this top end, our ability to produce large amounts of force, or the velocity end and being able to produce force in a very, very short time frame. Again, hopefully that makes sense. So this is this idea then of polarizing things. So to train force, very simply, we've got lots of different ways of going about this, but very simply, we want to be looking to train above 80%. Okay, looking to train above that 80% level. Because again, to go back to the overload principle, heavy strength training needs to be above the habitual level. So typically that is above 80%. So things like back squats, split squats, Romanian deadlifts, hip thrusts, deadlifts, leg press, anything where we can try to express large amounts of force independent of time now. It doesn't matter how quickly we're producing the force necessarily. What matters just is that we're producing large amounts of force, and we can look at other training interventions to try and reduce the amount of time that it takes to produce that force. But fundamentally, you've got to get stronger. Then, in terms of training the displacement component, well, this is where things like Olympic lifts can be really, really good, because you're moving a load through a large range of motions. You can see here with something like a hang clean, we're moving the load through a large displacement, and that's really effective then for expressing high levels of power. Now, if we only did that, you wouldn't necessarily increase your power optimally, because if you look at the training of Olympic weightlifters, they do a lot of very, very heavy back squatting, as an example, in order that they increase that that force component, because again, they're trying to produce high amounts of force quickly, So you've got to make sure we're looking at both sides of the equation. High amount of force, short time frame. If we're only looking at moderate loads over a big displacement, well, we're neither increasing the max velocity or the max force. So that's why kind of polarizing things can be a little bit more effective. So kind of combining exercises like this with heavy load training and high velocity training is going to be the best way to approach this. And again, with high velocity training, this is where out and out sprint training is going to be the most important thing. As a hockey player, speed on the pitch is absolutely paramount. And if we're doing things that aren't the sport, then it's unlikely it's going to transfer. So we've got to try and make this relevant as well. But maximal sprint efforts, again, above the habitual level. So really trying to push our ability to achieve high speeds. Above 90% of our velocity max is going to be required in order to continually nudge that top speed up. And usually you want exposure to this every single week. And the warm-up is always a really good way to do this. So try to include 2 or 3 max effort sprints with a rolling start, so you can build up to your max effort and then sprint for usually 20 to 30 meters with a good amount of recovery to make sure you are truly hitting top speeds. It's not a conditioning session. It's meant to be just getting exposure to your top speed. The reason why this is so important from a hockey perspective is that on the pitch, a lot of GPS data would show you don't actually ever hit max effort because you're carrying a stick, you're flexed over, you're in context, you're a bit fatigued. So the sport itself isn't going to give you max effort sprint training. You've got to make sure you're topping it up again by, usually in the warm-up, that's when I recommend doing it. Every week, getting exposure to it. So we're continually hitting that top velocity. So we're A, increasing our top speed. B, it's a great injury preventative thing because max effort sprinting is the highest demand your body's going to experience on the pitch. So you want to make sure we're conditioning those hamstrings, the adductors, the calves to these kind of velocities. So putting it all together, if we want to try and increase our power, then we've got to try and increase the force component with heavy load strength training. We've got to try and increase the displacement at which we can produce force over with things like Olympic lifting. And we need to try to reduce the time at which we can express this kind of power through things like max effort sprinting. So rather than just looking at the middle, which is moderate velocities, and just expressing what we currently have with things like broad jumps, we should be looking at the two ends of the spectrum here by trying to train heavy load strength training and out and out sprinting. And the middle kind of takes care of itself, because if you're getting massively quicker and you're getting really, really strong, then your power is going to go up, because they are the two components that contribute to max effort power expression again. So key message is, ask yourself, are you expressing power, or are you actually developing the things that genuinely make you more powerful? Hope that's been helpful. Drop a comment below with any questions.